Father Dubé starts out chapter 5 by pointing out that most disagreements are verbal disagreements. And if they're not verbal disagreements, they depend on a disagreement of first principles. As he says, for all this talk about voluntary poverty to make sense, we need to share the first principle of conversion, of being ready to take the gospel seriously. And with that in place, in this chapter, we can set out to clear aside a lot of verbal confusions. And he'll do this by explaining what voluntary poverty is not. So he says it's not carelessness or disorder or laziness, and it isn't destitution, which he defines as a lack of the basic necessities for a decent human life. And he qualifies that a little. Some saints are called to embrace destitution for the sake of solidarity with the destitute. But for most of us, destitution is not spiritually beneficial. As St. Thomas Aquinas says, grace builds on nature. And if the body doesn't have what it needs, it'll actually be harder to cultivate the spiritual life. And it's notable that actually superfluous wealth is not good for the body either. And it's also not miserliness. Voluntary poverty is nothing like miserliness because the miser is attached to his possessions. We want to be detached. Someone who has the virtue of voluntary poverty will be open handed with what they have. It's also not mere economy or bargain hunting, even though that could be a good thing if we're doing it so that we have more money to give away to the poor. Then that's a good thing, but it's not the same thing as voluntary poverty. And it's not mere detachment. And this is probably the most common mistake that people tend to make about voluntary poverty. They'll say, well, I'm detached, and therefore it's okay if I have all these possessions. But that's not true. As Father Dubé says, the gospel calls us to factual poverty as well as detachment. We need both of them. And here I'm reminded of a funny story I heard in a sermon where the priest said when he was 5 years old, he saw this brightly colored fly flying around his yard. And he tracked it down and finally he caught it in his cupped hands and held onto it. And then his hands started to really hurt and they hurt worse and worse. And pretty soon he was screaming and howling, but he still kept his hands clenched around that brightly colored fly that he had caught. And finally, his father showed up and pried his hands apart, and out flew this angry wasp. And the priest used that as a metaphor for detachment. So often what the things we're holding on to, they're not even good for us. They're not even really that enjoyable to hold on to deep down. And so obviously, detachment involves actually letting go of our superfluous wealth. It's not merely a spiritual attitude towards it. And Father Dubé says it's also not the same thing as availability. We're supposed to be available to people, but if we're available, our goods will probably be available to others as well. And pretty soon we won't have as many goods. We're also not supposed to be insensitive to beauty. And we can think here of St. Francis of Assisi, who among the saints is one of the greatest examples of voluntary poverty, but also of a great love for the created world. And Father Dubé says it's also not enough to say that we're using creation respectfully. And he says that's a very slippery sort of notion because it all depends on how you define respectful use. And if we define it properly, I would add, we'll probably be living a life of factual voluntary poverty. And finally, it's not a mere sentiment. It's not being sentimental towards the poor. It's something that requires concrete action and a very practical and rational outlook on the world. In the next chapter, he will start to talk about why voluntary poverty is essential for the gospel, what values it represents.